In a few moments, we're going to baptize young Thomas. He'll become the newest Christian on earth for a brief period of time until the next baptism happens, wherever that takes place around the globe. But I give his parents, Mary Ellen and Thomas, maybe 4 or 5 years before they reach that point that many of us who've raised kids or taught kids or been around small children all get to, where all of a sudden our child will stand up to the fullness of their stature, sometimes put their hands on their hips and say, "You're not the boss of me." It comes eventually for all of us, and it's not a bad thing. It's part of the process of realizing that we are individual human beings with ideas and thoughts and a will of our own. And even at a young age, we start to realize that it's not always great when somebody wants us to bend to their will and to do what they want us to do. And part of the learning we have to do is what that means for us as individuals. Now, the second lesson that follows right behind it is often don't mess with mom and dad. And depending on our generation, depends on how many times we could get away with something like that. In my house, when I was growing up, maybe I would get away with it once. If I tried it a second time, I better be fast on my feet, so to speak. But it is natural, and it's what we all do in some way at some point. The phrase, "you're not the boss of me," is not new to me. I've heard it before. I'm sure you have as well. It's been rising in popularity, especially in the last few decades. But it's not a new saying. It might have been popularized by a They Might Be Giants song, or by the fact that that song was used as the intro to Malcolm in the Middle, a popular show that was on the air for 5 or 6 years. But it's been around for at least 150 years. And even though I'm familiar with the phrase, I found it peculiar in the midst of biblical study and preparation for today, as one commentator reflecting on the gospel assigned for today as we continue in Jesus' sermon from the plain in Luke's gospel, suggests that for those who understand what Jesus is calling us to in that gospel, it is a way of standing up to the forces of this world and saying to them, "You're not the boss of me," which I'd never thought of in that context before. So this past Wednesday night, we had our first of a 2-part series with Dr. Jacob Wright, author and scripture theologian, Hebrew scripture theologian. He zoomed in with us. He'll be here in person this Wednesday after dinner to continue his discussion with us. And I'm looking forward to it. I think having him in person will be even better because he's brilliant. And when he's on the Zoom screen looking at our big room full of people, we're all about this tiny on his screen. So there wasn't the normal interaction you get with a teacher or a professor who at times can go above your head, but read it on the faces of people. Preachers learn to do it too. If everybody's frowning at you, you've either said something you shouldn't have or you need to find a different way to say it. So I think there may be a few times when he's in the room, he can see where he's getting over our heads and rephrase or come at his idea from a different way. But nonetheless, it was a great lecture, and there were some great pieces to it that stuck with me, like his assertion that these ancient texts in the Bible have something to say to the world today, that they contain some very important keys to how we manage the world that we live in, with its brokenness and its division and the problems that we have, that these stories of God and God's people about communities forming and breaking and struggling with their faithfulness to God can very much give us the clues to rebuild what it feels like may be on the way out, and to maybe even strengthen it even more. And because of that, I was thinking of it when I was preparing for today and reading the passage from Genesis and the story of Joseph that we heard a minute ago. It's really getting down to the end of that story that some of us know very well. They made it into a Broadway musical, after all, where Joseph is beloved by his father, so much so that his brothers become jealous and they decide they've got to do away with their brother. And they make the plan to get rid of him, but short of killing him, they sell him into slavery, and he makes his way to Egypt. And as you read through these chapters of Genesis, it's a roller coaster for Joseph. He's got moments of success, moments where he's got opportunity, and moments where he is suffering and where he is at the lowest of lows. But ultimately, by being faithful to God and to what God places before him, he rises to this important level second only to Pharaoh. And as you read through this and you hear that it's Joseph and his ability to to dream and understand the dreams of others that helps Egypt weather this famine, and everybody's coming to them for help because the crops are destroyed and people are starving. It's that scenario that brings his brothers to Egypt on a couple of trips where they meet Joseph and have no idea that this is their brother they had sold into slavery. And he doesn't correct them or tell them who he is. He torments them a little bit. He tests them a little bit. He seems to be looking for a change of heart or a growth in their character. But we get to this point of the story that we hear today, and it's the climax of the story because he's about to unmask himself to his brothers and remind them that he's still alive and that he remembers what they did to him. And so we who are hearers and readers of that text start to get a little anxious. What will he do with that power? Will he pay them back for how they treated him, or will there be another outcome? And as we heard this morning, ultimately, Joseph leads with grace and love and forgiveness for his brothers. They end with kisses and conversation, a sign that their relationship is, if not restored, on the way to restoration. And he wants them to be in his life and to join him in Egypt. And that is not what many of us would expect, because that's not the way the world tends to work. But Joseph chose that way, and it stands out as an incredible lesson to us when we will hear it and see it for what it is. That grace and mercy can be the response, even when we are terribly mistreated. So there are elements from these scripture passages that teach us things that can be used in our world today, but we have to be very careful. Because as you get into Scripture, you know that Scripture says a lot of things. And some things that we may want to hold on to are not the things we need to hold on to. Some things that we raise up from Scripture are not the things we need to be raising up, because it's a very complex book over thousands of years, telling the story of lots of people, not all of whom were frankly great human beings. And so not that long ago, it's within the last 4 or 5 years, there was a preacher who made headlines nationally who preached on this text and used it as a way to say, maybe chattel slavery wasn't that bad after all. There were some good things that came out of it for enslaved people. And you'll remember the expectable and deserved outcry against that. But that comes from the element of the story where Joseph says, yeah, I can't really be mad at my brothers and pay them back, because in the midst of all the suffering and the trials and the fact that they sold me as a slave, God was in the midst of it. And so maybe it's God who did all these things. So how can I be upset with them if it's ultimately been a story of blessing? But you have to be really careful with messages like that, because it lets us off the hook and focuses sometimes on the wrong things. People today use the same sentiment to explain why certain personalities and powers of this world may not be ideal, but we have to trust that God's in the midst of them working for good. And who are we to get in the way? Because Scripture tells us that God can do things with people that we would normally say were terrible, which is frankly a bit of a cop-out. Because it wasn't as though people knew that as history was unfolding in the days in which these events took place. It's looking back on them now that we can see a thread of God's rebuilding and God's vision that can make good come from bad, because God can make good come from all sorts of things. But as we talked about in our men's group on Wednesday morning this week, we often fall into the trap of confusing correlation with causation. That when bad things happen and we see God in the midst, our tendency is to think, oh, God must be behind this because I've met God along the way. God must be behind this because something good has come from this terrible thing. And it doesn't mean God caused it, but it does speak that God is with us through all things, good and bad and in between. And we don't want to get too far out ahead of that and pretend as though we know what it means. So we have to be careful when we look at ancient texts to make sure that we're looking at them the right way and we're focusing on the things we should focus on. And for us as Christians, it is the lens of Jesus Christ that helps us do that. So there's a teacher who became an author and a blogger who certainly knows those moments where children of that age also go through the period of coming into their own, as it were. It can be a little bit difficult. And she had a post that gets at this in a powerful way to remind us how to keep this before us. She said, genocide is biblical. Loving your enemy is biblical. But only one is Christ-like. Slavery is biblical. Chain breaking is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Patriarchy is biblical. Countercultural elevation of women is also biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Retributive violence is biblical. Grace-filled restoration is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Segregation is biblical. Unity is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. And she makes the point very strongly that it is Christ who transformed the world, not just ancient texts of Scripture, holy may they be, when we view them in little pieces or in a vacuum, but to look at the whole story of God and God's people as God has passed it on through the prophets and most efficiently through Jesus Christ himself, to interpret what then we are to do in the world and how we are to respond to the moments that we face. Which brings us back to this Sermon on the Plain in Luke's Gospel, which we began last week with Luke's version of the Beatitudes. The acknowledgement of 4 groups as blessed that we wouldn't think of, the poor and the hungry. And the groups that we typically don't think need a lot of help from us, that he said, woe, warning for them who are in a great place and have plenty, that they should be careful. What he was speaking about last week in our lectionary was the truth of how God's kingdom and God's economy can work. And if that is true, then what we hear today is the example of how we live that out. And there's a nugget in this reading today that I think most of us picked up on upon hearing that we know is central and one of the things we try to instill in our children from a young age. We heard this morning the golden rule, which in this community, if you've got kids in school, the Katz-Whittle Foundation makes sure that our schools are teaching the golden rule and recognizing the kids who seem to embody it in each classroom and each school, because we realize how important it is to hear, as we hear from Jesus, and even in other traditions, that the way to operate in this world is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, not the way it typically works, where I'm going to do to you whatever you do to me. And some people take it further and say, you mess with me, you get it 3 times as bad in return. But there is this call to say, no, there's a difference here. We can resist the way the world wants to work, not in an aggressive way, not in a violent way, but also not in a passive way. And to resist by being active in love in return, which is how Jesus gets to the place of saying, love your enemy. Seek the goodwill of the abuser. If somebody strikes you on one cheek, give them the other one. If somebody steals your coat, give them your shirt too. If somebody takes from you, don't try to get it back. Incredibly wild ideas for most of us on most days to try to embody and to live into. But that's the essence of how we can apply those lessons everywhere in our life to interpret what is the most Christ-like response, and where do we turn in our tradition and in our faith as we look to respond. In a few weeks, some of us are going down to Jacksonville to see Les Mis and the performance that's traveling around the country. Many of you have seen it or read the book, and you know that this sentiment is captured in that scene where Jean Valjean is out of prison and he can't go anywhere or do anything because he's a convict, so the bishop takes him into his home and feeds him and clothes him and lets him clean up. And of course, Jean Valjean doesn't think he has a lot of options, so he steals all the silver in the night and takes off. When the authorities find him with all the stolen silver, they bring him back to the bishop, expecting the bishop to give witness so they can send him back to prison. And instead, the bishop says, no, I gave him the silver. And in fact, Jean Valjean, what were you thinking? You forgot the candlesticks. And he has the candlesticks brought and adds them to the sack of plunder. And that moment of grace reshapes Jean Valjean's life and reshapes the rest of the story as he becomes one who lives a life that tries to show that grace to others, even to the point where it can cost him his own life. I think many of us know that story as well. And it's powerful. And it's worth paying attention to what Jesus is getting at here, because it's not just kids who reach a point of understanding about their autonomy and their ability to choose who they're going to listen to and not listen to. And fortunately, they reach an age where they test us and they realize, I got to listen to mom and dad, but eventually they grow up and they become adults and they realize, well, maybe I don't have to listen to everything mom and dad say. I can go my own way. I can chart my own course. Many of us have lived that as well. But it doesn't stop. That process is ongoing in our lives where we recognize we get to choose who we listen to. And Jesus says, those who can listen to what I'm about to tell you, because not everybody does. But we get to listen to the voices that are calling for us to take action and to respond and choose what our response is going to be. And as adults, too, who go through this life, we still have moments where we can stand up into the full stature of Christ, or as much into that stature as we can, to be as faithful as we can. And stand up to those voices that we hear about in the gospel, the kind of a world that says, I'm going to help the people who help me, I'm going to punish the people who don't go with me. And what that leads to in the world when everybody follows that path, and it doesn't lead to a good end. It is the idea that Christ lays out in this sermon and what it means to follow God that is most important. Because it's not just schools that raise bullies and tyrants alongside the students who can learn the golden rule and apply it. Both may find success in the world, but if we get to choose, we want more of the folks who understand the golden rule, not a world full of bullies. And sometimes in this world, we encounter those forces in the world that draw us into playing by those rules. And we have to make the choice to stand up and say, no, I know who my boss is. And my boss is one of love and grace and forgiveness and unity, and seeing the world in ways that build up the people, even the ones who are hard on me and difficult on me, who hate me, and I can hopefully break those trends through love and active, loving resistance to those forces. So none of us needs to go through this world thinking we're done or we've got it all figured out, but to be aware of those moments when we do need to stand up into our stature and remember who we are and whose we are, and tell those forces in the world, you're not the boss of me.